Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Carrie Anderson, production editor at the Texas National Security Review. What follows is a book talk by Talmage Boston, who wrote How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents.
I'm glad to be here. I'm hoping that you're here for one reason, and that is you love history. And there are some lowbrows from the great unwashed who may ask, well, what good is history? And my answer to them is two reasons. One, it shows us how much things change, and two, how much they stay the same. And sometimes history can actually be applied to daily living. And that's my goal today, showing you two ways in which, because things have stayed the same, they can therefore be applied by you. First, to be a great leader, you've got to be a great persuader. And second, the traits that make someone a great persuader are the same now as they were in George Washington's day. Now, as Paul mentioned in his introduction, the title of my book that just came out last week is called How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. You would not hurt my feelings if you bought several copies after the program is over and gave them to your family and friends. But it's a combination of leadership / presidential history book, and it covers the most important leadership traits of our 8 greatest presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Reagan. And the book's target audience is anyone who loves American history and through that love wants to find ways to improve his or her leadership journey. So I'm hoping that you fit within the scope of that target audience. In researching the strengths of our greatest presidents, I realized that they were all great persuaders, though as you'll see, they each persuaded in different ways. And exactly how they succeeded as persuaders in leading our nation to new heights is worthy of our attention today, because one way or another, we are all in the persuasion business. So with that in mind, let's turn to the presidents, see exactly what it was that made them great persuaders, and use that knowledge to raise our games as leaders in our fields. First great president, George Washington. As far as persuasion went, Washington was not a great public speaker. I learned this recently in the research for the chapter, that he had a soft, breathy voice because he'd had a childhood respiratory illness. And those of you who've studied his life realize his adult life was filled with problems with his teeth, such that during his presidency, he only had one tooth remaining in his head, and he had these incredibly unwieldy dentures that made talking a challenge. If you ever go to Mount Vernon, those dentures are on display, and it's like trying to talk through a small bird cage. But despite his voice and his teeth issues, what he said was persuasive, because everyone respected him. They knew of his heroic deeds, his courage shown in the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, and in leading the Constitutional Convention. And the stature that he gained from those accomplishments certainly earned him the trust of others. But besides his achievements, there was something more that caused him to earn others' trust. First, he always looked like a leader, right out of central casting. He was always the tallest guy in the room, 6'3", which would be like being 6'10" today. He was always a sharp dresser, immaculate attire, ramrod straight posture. He moved with an athlete's grace. He maintained piercing eye contact with anybody he was speaking to. So if you were in George Washington's presence and you were doing the talking through this eye contact, you knew this guy is listening. The portrait artist Gilbert Stuart, who drew his portrait on several occasions, said, you looked in his eyes and you saw the fiercest warrior in the jungle. He also always rode an impressive white hat. So you put all of these physical traits and the way he presented himself together, and he epitomized the term command presence. I'd never heard that term until I got to interview James Baker several years ago. He talks about command presence, which he certainly has. And so those of you in this audience who are seeking to up your leadership game, when you leave the house in the morning, look in the mirror and ask yourself, how's my command presence these days? Washington was also a great persuader because he had 100% integrity and therefore 100% credibility. Famously, the old fable, Parson Weems' story of his childhood, he told his dad, "I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree." Well, that was a fable. It wasn't true, but Parson Weems was trying to come up with a story that would instill the belief that, no, this guy really could not tell a lie from childhood on, and that was true of George Washington. Such that when he spoke, everyone knew that they could take his words to the bank, and so they listened. So ask yourself, am I known for integrity and credibility in my circle? Washington also knew when to keep his mouth shut. During his presidency, division among the political leaders grew month by month. Soon, two political parties were formed, the Federalists on the one hand, the Republicans on the other, and Washington had become president in hopes of keeping the country unified. And so as the factions got more and more harsh and bitter, and Washington more and more wanted to try to maintain unity, he knew that if he took one side or the other, he would be wading into the partisan fray, which he wanted no part of. So he kept his mouth shut. He listened. As president, he famously didn't make any decisions on controversial issues until he had received memorandums from the competing sides. And then and only then, after he'd considered both sides, would he make his final decision. He had a reputation for being a great decision maker. Surprise, surprise, a great decision maker because you listen to both sides of the argument. So ask yourself, am I a unifier in my organization? Do I know when and when not to speak, to stay above the fray? George Washington, a great persuader with command presence, total credibility, and because he did what it took to be a unifier. Second great president, Thomas Jefferson. Like Washington, Jefferson was a poor public speaker. This was another interesting thing that came out in my research. Thomas Jefferson was president for 8 years. During that time, he gave a grand total of 2 speeches, his 2 inaugural addresses. But as you know, persuasion doesn't always have to take place in front of large crowds. Much of the time, it needs to take place in small groups. And that's where Jefferson was a master. In small groups, he would he would schedule dinners 2 to 3 times a week, every single week of his 8-year presidency. And around the dinner table, great food, lots of wine, Federalists, Republicans, building rapport, building relationships, and the walls started to come down. You remember during his predecessor, John Adams' presidency, Adams was a Federalist, Congress was controlled by the Federalists, and because the Republicans were expressing their opposition to many of the Federalist policies, the Federalist Congress, with Adams' full approval, passed the Sedition Act, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anyone to criticize either President Adams or Federalist policy. Fortunately, that act expired at the end of Adams' term, but that was the country that Jefferson was coming into as president. And so famously, in his first inaugural address, his first and one of his 2 presidential speeches, he opened it by saying, look, folks, we are all Federalists. We are all Republicans, i.e., we are all Americans, and we better start acting that way or this country isn't going to last long. So he made it a rigorous daily exercise to bring people together. They didn't talk about the hot political issues at these dinners. They talked about history and literature and music and what they did for a living. And soon it became a conversation among friends, which made him the master of the politics of the close personal relationship. In his Jefferson biography, John Meacham said that at his dinners, the president's, quote, social civility, grace, and hospitality softened the strident partisanship as feelings evolved from hostility to at least partial respect. So ask yourself, am I working to improve my relationships with those who, as of now, don't always agree with me? Thomas Jefferson, a great persuader, as a relentless relationship builder. Third great president, Abraham Lincoln. Most people agree that Lincoln was our most eloquent president. So how did he become so eloquent? Since he had less than 1 year of formal schooling. The answer? His eloquence came from three activities that spanned most of his life. The first, his entire life, starting in childhood, he read constantly and memorized large chunks of books written by the greatest writers in history. Aesop's fables, Shakespeare's plays, the King James Bibles, and the classic poets. Second, he was an incredibly successful lawyer, both trial and appellate. And because he was in both of those arenas, he knew he had to know his audiences and choose words that would work with the particular audience. You speak differently to juries than you do to judges, than you do to courts of appeal. Third, he was a politician for most of his adult life who ran for office, and meaning he spoke to crowds constantly. And for him, practice made perfect. So these three word power foundations from his years as a reader, a lawyer, and a politician caused Lincoln to hone his skills as a persuader for the last 35 years of his life. So what were these skills that made Lincoln's words hit the bullseye every single time? Well, there were 5 of them that made him such a persuasive leader. First, he was obsessed with word precision. He said exactly what he meant with no ambiguity, and he never used an unnecessary word. And that only comes after many, many, many rounds of editing before you remove all the unnecessary words and remove all the potential ambiguities. The Gettysburg Address, 270 words, took 2.5 minutes to deliver. Every word is huge and has stood the test of time and will continue. His second inaugural address, the one that at the end talks about with malice toward none, with charity for all, 702 words, took 5.5 minutes. No unnecessary word, complete intelligibility, no ambiguity. So ask yourself, how many edits do I go through before I'm satisfied that my words are as airtight as I can make them? Second important word power trait. Like Washington, he never misrepresented or overstated anything. Remember his nickname, Honest Abe. So he had complete credibility. Third, he built rapport with his audiences by using wit and telling stories. That's always a great way to get their audience connected to you. People love stories. People love funny stories. He didn't overdo it, didn't try to be a comedian, but he built rapport with his audiences by using wit and stories. Fourth, when he reached his persuasion climax, he spoke with an impassioned, earnest tone. You saw that in the way Daniel Day-Lewis portrayed Lincoln in the movie. But he never got emotional. He thought to try to make your point by being emotional was ultimately intellectually dishonest. He wanted no part of that. And fifth, and perhaps most importantly and most overlooked, he made sure that his words in his public remarks had rhythm. Remember how the Gettysburg Address ended? This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And this government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Rhythm, words that resonate, reverberate, and ultimately penetrate. Ask yourself, when I make a presentation, do my words have rhythm? Abe Lincoln, a great persuader because he maximized his word power. Next president, Theodore Roosevelt. It was Theodore Roosevelt who coined the phrase that the presidency gave the man, or in the future women, whoever had the presidency had the power of the bully pulpit. And though he spoke to crowds often, and he loved to speak to crowds, in fact, he was not a great public speaker. Yes, he was energetic in his speeches, but for the most part, his words were not particularly memorable. He didn't have the rhythm. He spoke too fast. But he showed that he did have the power of persuasion most effectively, not from preaching from the bully pulpit, but in situations where he became a mediator, up close and personal. When people were involved in some type of a dispute, they couldn't resolve it for themselves. They needed a neutral to bring them together, to find common ground, and that's where Theodore Roosevelt was a master. He'd been president 1 year when all of a sudden there was a national coal strike. And it went on, and with the country, half the country was on the verge of freezing to death. And they had no idea how to solve it. And so Roosevelt, no president in history had ever gotten involved in a labor dispute before, but he realized, if I don't get involved, this thing isn't going to settle, and we're going to have half the country frozen to death. And so he stepped in, got the parties together, got them to agree to binding arbitration, and soon the dispute was over. Nobody froze to death. Word got around the world that Theodore Roosevelt knew how to bring parties together, mediate, and produce a settlement. And so in 1905, Japan and Russia were at war. They didn't want to be at war, but they didn't know how to stop the war. So they brought Theodore Roosevelt in. He brought them together. He found terms of settlement that they could agree on, and he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Same thing happened with the Moroccan conflict later in his presidency, and one at the Hague Convention. So his success was incredible. And here's how Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her biography of Roosevelt called The Bully Pulpit, described his power as a mediator. Quote, "He used his unusual powers of concentration, his rich cadre of ideas, and his ruthless single-mindedness, together with warmth, unabashed intensity, and pluck of personality, to move people toward settlement." So ask yourself, when I'm involved in a situation, whether it's at my university, my company, wherever you happen to be, and there's people in conflict, and they don't seem to be making any progress, are you being proactive to jump in as a mediator and to try to find common ground to bring it to an end? So Theodore Roosevelt, a great persuader, as a focused, shrewd, and emotionally intelligent mediator. Fifth great president, Franklin Roosevelt. FDR was persuasive because he mastered two ways of public speaking. First, powerful oratory with snap, crackle, and pop delivery when he spoke to crowds. And secondly, a conversational style in his fireside chats in which he gently moved Americans to his way of thinking. As for the oratory, from the very start, his first inaugural address, the country is consumed in the Great Depression. At the very beginning, FDR says, "First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It made Americans stop and think and be at least a little less fearful, because this president had stepped up, he was ready to take charge, and he was ready to calm my fears about being afraid of the future. In his public address the day after the bombing at Pearl Harbor, here were his opening words. "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. We will not only defend ourselves to the utmost, we'll make certain that this form of treachery will never happen again. It made Americans want to join the war effort, defeat the enemy right now. But in addition to this commanding oratory, he also persuaded people with a gentle conversational delivery in his fireside chats on the radio. He gave his first chat 8 days into his first term. On the 7th day, because there was a national panic and a run on the banks, he shut all the banks in the country. On the 8th day, he gave his fireside chat. And in it, matter-of-factly, calmly, here's what we've done in the last few days. Here's why it was done. And here's what our next steps are going to be. He had a plan. He was calm. Panic gone. The next day, the banks are all reopened, and the panic is gone. So his reassuring words caused an immediate turnaround in people's confidence. And when the banks opened the next day, the panic had ended. So ask yourself, in my presentations, do I know when to speak forcefully and when to speak calmly? For both types of persuasion, FDR had success because he knew what people wanted to hear, because he was the master of gaining knowledge about the full status of public sentiment. How did he get full knowledge about all the different groups in the public sentiment? He held frequent press conferences. He canvassed the country on car and train trips. He absorbed his wife Eleanor's assessments of where the country stood, and Eleanor was on the road all the time and would come home and report to her husband, here's what the people in Arizona are thinking. Here's what the people in Michigan are thinking. He also stayed on top of the new emerging industry public opinion polls, and he also brought in leaders of both political parties to understand where they were coming from. So all these approaches to gaining as complete of information as could about the status of public sentiment was crucial. You can't move public sentiment until you know what it is. So ask yourself, do I go the extra mile to make sure I know what all the groups in my organization are thinking? But then once he knew what the people were thinking, he had to think of a strategy for get them to move public sentiment toward his way of thinking. And he did it incrementally. You try to make bold statements too fast before people can process them, come to grips with them, and finally begin to change your mind. You don't do that in one speech. You do it over a course of time, and that's where FDR was a master. In particular, in the late 30s and 1940s, Hitler pursued his reign of terror across Europe, and at the start of it, most Americans in the late 30s were isolationists. They didn't want to get involved in another war halfway around the world. They'd done that 20 years before in World War I. They didn't want to do it again. But FDR could see that if the U.S. didn't help Churchill and Great Britain, then Hitler would soon have total control of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and the high seas. And if he did that, his next target would surely be the United States. FDR saw that. Other people around the country, stuck in an isolationist mindset, refused to acknowledge it. He had to move the needle, and he did it incrementally. On the radio, he said things like, this is not a fireside chat on war. It's a talk on national security. Later in another chat, he told the country, the war is now approaching the brink of the Western Hemisphere itself. It's coming very close to home. Anyone with an atlas, anyone with a reasonable knowledge of the sudden striking force of modern war knows that it is stupid to wait until a probable enemy has gained a foothold from which to attack. How could anyone possibly disagree with that? And so his words, messaged strategically, step by step over time, so people could process his thoughts and begin to understand what was going on and be able to put aside the statements made by the isolationists like Charles Lindbergh. And finally, they reached FDR's final conclusion, and he moved America's mindset away from isolationism and toward a desired effort to join the war movement. So that's how persuasion works best. Knowing your group's sentiment, all aspects of the group, and then speaking in a way that moves the listeners at the right pace for them to process the information until they finally get your goal and are able to embrace where you want them to go. So ask yourself, when I need to change the direction at my company, do I move people or try to move people at an incremental pace so that they'll come around and ultimately agree on my point? FDR, a great persuader who knew when to speak with vigor, when to speak calmly, and knew how to gauge and change public sentiment. Sixth great president, Dwight Eisenhower. Though he was not a great public speaker, historians now rate him as our fifth greatest president. Lincoln, Washington, FDR, Theodore Roosevelt. Number 5, Eisenhower. Why? Because when he set his goal, by golly, he persuaded people how to get it done. In particular, to get things done, he knew when to be patient and when to play hardball against anyone who tried to block his path. Look at how he directed D-Day. He waited patiently for the weather to clear, and then he played hardball with the Normandy invasion. On his desk in the Oval Office was a saying that epitomized his style of leadership: gently in manner, strongly in deed. An example of his exercising patience to accomplish his objective was his handling of Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare at the start of his presidency. Many told him that he should do what Truman did, attack McCarthy directly, go head to head with him. But he refused to get in the gutter with the witch hunter. He would not even say Joe McCarthy's name in public. Instead, during his first few months in office, he orchestrated a plan whereby he gave McCarthy just enough rope to hang himself. And a year later, the plan brought him to the Army McCarthy hearings, and Army lawyer Joseph Welch, in fact, hung McCarthy to dry, the end of McCarthyism, and Eisenhower never even had to get his hands dirty. So ask yourself, do I have patience in a crisis to pursue the best strategy, or do I just do a knee-jerk and react quickly without thinking about the other options? An example of Ike's knowing when and how to play hardball came right before the election date in November 1956, before his second term. America's allies, England, France, and Israel, had joined forces, invaded Egypt, and seized the Suez Canal. And they did it despite Ike's having told them beforehand, don't do that. You do that, it's going to disrupt the balance of power in the Cold War. It's going to cause all problems. Don't even think about doing it. They did it anyway. They thought it was a week before the election. Eisenhower wouldn't do anything to create problems with the Jews in the American election. They thought they could get away with it, but they were wrong. Eisenhower responded quickly and firmly to the three countries who had rejected his advice and had seized the Suez. First, he got the UN to impose sanctions against them. Next, he refused their request for an alternative source for oil. And finally, he refused to provide the dollars needed to stabilize the British pound. So, shortly thereafter, there did come a ceasefire, and yet Britain would not move their troops out of the Suez. And when Ike saw that, he immediately made a run on the British pound and then told the British Prime Minister that if the British troops weren't withdrawn immediately, then Ike would drive the pound down to 0. The British troops left the Suez in a nanosecond. That's how you play hardball. So ask yourself, When people disrupt my plan, go against what I've expressly said, and do I know how and when to play hardball to bring things into the way I want them to be? So Dwight Eisenhower, a great persuader because he knew when to be patient and when to play hardball and move quickly and forcefully to achieve his goals. The seventh great president, John F. Kennedy. It started even before he was president. He demonstrated in the 1960 presidential campaign. He was a Catholic. We'd never had a Catholic president before. And he persuaded the American people that his loyalty was to the United States and not to the Pope. And he won that election, even though people like Norman Vincent Peale opposed him on the sole ground that he was a Catholic. Then he gets elected. His 1961 inaugural address, he urged Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And a few weeks later, he starts the Peace Corps, and tens of thousands of young Americans decide they want to follow the inaugural address, what they can do for the country, and they join the Peace Corps. A year later, his 1962 speech at Rice Stadium in Houston. With these words, he inspired the support for the American Moonshot program. Quote, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, unwilling to postpone, and we intend to win." And Congress then proceeded to fund the Moonshot program, and we got to the moon before the end of the decade. The power of words to become deeds. The Peace Corps, the Moonshot, and then most importantly, overall, 1963, he persuaded Americans that ending Jim Crow and giving civil rights to African Americans was no longer a political issue, it was a moral issue. In 1963, we had the Birmingham riots. In charge of those riots was the Sheriff Bull Connor. You probably read about him. And he got out the fire hoses and he turned them on black children. And he had a team of vicious attack dogs and he turned them on the black adults. And it was all on national television. And when Kennedy saw it that night, he made a speech on television that was largely spontaneous. But he said in it, quote, "We face a moral crisis as a country and as a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in our daily lives. A great change is at hand, and it is our task, our obligation, to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all." Close quote. Soon after that speech, he submits a strong civil rights bill to Congress. A couple months later, he gets killed. Fortunately, LBJ takes that bill and pushes it through, and it becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So ask yourself, when I'm trying to persuade my team to go in a challenging new direction, what's my strategy? Biographer Stephen Knott said what made Kennedy's words not only be heard, but for people to act on was because he was always appealing to the better angels of their natures. The famous words from Lincoln's first inaugural address. He was not appealing to their dark sides the way our presidents these days do, which is why nobody wants to follow them, because they're no longer appealing to our better angels the way John F. Kennedy did. So Kennedy, a great persuader, because he knew how to touch hearts and minds, that if something needed to be done, it could be done as long as we followed through on the commitment to do the right thing. The eighth and last great president, Ronald Reagan, who entered the White House in January of 1981, when the country was in serious decline after the disastrous presidency of Jimmy Carter. Double-digit inflation, low economic growth, high unemployment, long gas lines, and we couldn't rescue the hostages from Iran. Our country needed somebody to persuade us that America was and should always be exceptional. And that person who made Americans rethink the importance of who we are now and forever, the exceptionalism, was Ronald Reagan. He repeatedly said to the nation with contagious conviction, we're here to do whatever it takes. America should be a shining city on a hill. My strategy for the Cold War, we win, they lose. On his Oval Office desk, a block of wood, it can, all caps C-A-N, it can be done. It was that kind of optimism that never wavered and on which he followed through that brought an end to the Cold War, revived the American economy, and restored our nation's belief in itself. Pessimists don't move mountains. Only optimists move mountains, and Reagan's presidency proved that. So ask yourself, am I inspiring optimism in my organization? So there you have it, Clements Center for National Security and other guests. May you remember how our greatest presidents used their unique styles of persuasion to achieve success. George Washington, persuasion as an accomplished command presence with unwavering integrity who knew when and when not to speak to maintain unity. Thomas Jefferson, persuasion as a relentless relationship builder. Abe Lincoln, persuasion by maximizing word power through clarity, sincerity, and precision. Theodore Roosevelt, persuasion as a mediator who found common ground between conflicting factions. Franklin Roosevelt, persuasion by knowing when to speak forcefully and when to speak calmly, and knew what the public sentiment was and how to change it. Dwight Eisenhower, persuasion by knowing when to be patient and when and how to play hardball when necessary. John Kennedy, persuasion by inspiring us to be guided by the better angels of our nature, not by our dark sides. And Reagan, persuasion driven by constant, sincere optimism. So now that you know the history behind how the best did it, may you apply it to your leadership persuasion repertoire. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.